Hello and welcome to section 3, using core data to persist your data. In this section, we're initially going to have a look at understanding the core data terminology. After that, we're going to look at how we create entities and attributes within the core data editor. Then we'll take a look at how we can save data, and after that, how we can retrieve data using NSFetchResults controller. Then we'll look at what we do to update the data, and then how we can look at deleting the data. And finally, we'll look at how we can update the database. So in this video, we're going to have a look at how we can understand the core data terminology. First of all, we're going to look at how we create an NS-managed object model. And then we'll take a look at what exactly is an NS-persistent store coordinator and what it means for your project. Then we'll have a look at how we can create NS-managed object contexts, both private and main queue. And finally, we'll look at how we save our objects onto the NS-managed object contexts. We are currently using NS user defaults to persist our data. However, we want to take advantage of Apple's proprietary data framework, CoreData, to work with creating objects we can use. We are working with Model View Controller methodology in this project, and CoreData is a framework that you use to manage the model layer objects in your application. Within our project, CoreData consists of two parts: the data model, and the code that controls the data model. You can think of the data model as the part of our project that defines what our models will be, which will create the SQLite database tables, rows, and columns based on the object we specify. So we'll begin by adding a data model to our project. We can do this by clicking on our project navigator and pressing Command N to add a new file. In here, we can see on the left-hand side there is a section called Core Data. When we click on this, we are given a few choices, and we will select Data Model. To keep this simple, we're going to call this model Core Data. Once this is added, we are going to again press Command N and begin adding a helper class that will manage all of our core functionality around working with core data. So we'll select a Swift file, then call this Core Data Manager. Make sure this is added to our target and press Enter. Now, let's click into this file and define a new class called Core Data Manager. Some of this work is fairly substantial in terms of memory overhead, and we will not want to set our variables until we have need to call them. So for the majority of this manager, we'll be heavily utilizing the lazy var approach. To begin with, let's create a lazy variable that accesses the documents directory. We do this by calling lazy var application documents directory, and we'll set that as an NS URL. Then we'll put equals and open up our curly braces. Then it'll be let URLs equals nsFileManager.defaultManager.URLs for directory, and then here we'll put .document directory, and for in domains we'll use the user domain mask. Finally, we'll return the last item in the URL list, or if this doesn't exist, then we'll simply return an NS URL. Next, we want to create our managed object model. This is, for all intents and purposes, the database schema. It contains definitions for each of the objects that you'll want to be storing in the database. This is the code that relates to the data model we have just added to the project. So again, we're going to create another lazy var. So it's lazy var manage object model, NS manage object model. We'll make this optional. In here, we're going to look into our project for the resource name Core Data with an extension of MOMD, which is the generated output file for the file we added earlier. Then we'll create an NS managed object model from the URL, or if there is no URL, then we'll return nil. The next item we'll create is the persistent store coordinator. This is the code that connects to the database. Here, we set up the names and locations of what databases we'll be using to store our objects. Anytime we need to save, we'll have to go through this object. So we write lazy var persistent store coordinator, NS persistent store coordinator, and again we'll make this optional. Then we'll put a quick safety check in place using a guard statement. So it's guard let manage object model equals self.manageObjectModel, else we'll return nil. And below this, if it exists, I want to create a new persistent store coordinator with the model. So it's var coordinator, ns persistent store coordinator equals ns persistent store coordinator, and we pass in the manage object model. I'll then specify my database location. So it's let URL equals self.application documents directory dot URL by appending path component, and then in here I'll put dreamseeker.sqlite. Then we'll do a quick do catch statement to try to create my database. So within here, I'll put try coordinator, add persistent store with type, ns-SQLite store type, configuration nil, pass in the URL, and put nil for the options. And then if there's an error, I'll just catch it and set the coordinator to nil. Otherwise, I'll throw a fatal error. And finally, I'll return the coordinator. The next two items we'll create are two managed object contexts. The managed object contexts hold the objects that come from the database, pending changes. Whenever you need to get objects, insert objects, or delete objects, you call methods on the managed object context. We're creating two contexts here for the sake of keeping our code clean. One we can use for writing to the database, and the other we can use for retrieving. First, let's create a private one for writing purposes. So I'll put lazy private var writer managed object context, and I'll set this as an ns managed object context. Again, I'm going to guard, this time with let coordinator equals self.persistent store coordinator, otherwise I'll return nil. Then I'll put let managed object context equals ns managed object context, concurrency type, private queue concurrency type, which sets this as a private managed object context. I'll set the managed object context persistent store coordinator to coordinator, and then I'll return the managed object context. And now we'll create our public managed object context. So I'll put lazy var managed object context, and then managed object context, optional. And then I'll put let managed object context, ns managed object context, concurrency type, main queue concurrency type, meaning that this will run on our main queue. And then I'll set our managed object context parent context to our writer managed object context that we created before, and I'll return the managed object context. And finally, we'll create a method that allows us to save the data when we have finished our actions. So we'll create save context as a function and pass in a context. And I'll put if private context has changes, then I'll make the private context perform a block. And within here, I'll put a do catch statement. And I'll try to save the private context. And if I catch an error, I'm going to print out the localized description. And finally, at the end, if the private context has a parent context, then I'll save that context. So now we have all the code that we need in order to set up our database and to get things going. And so, now that we've created our core data manager,